Hello, Dr. Grande here. Today I'll be offering an update on the Sarah Boone case. Specifically, I'll be taking a look at her testimony. First, I'll go through the background of this case briefly. I've covered this several times before. Move to a summary of Sarah Boone's testimony on the stand, then offer my analysis. Sarah Boone lived with her boyfriend, George Torres, in Winter Park, Florida, which is near Orlando. On February 24, 2020, she called the police and said her boyfriend was dead. The police found that George had been zipped into a suitcase and died from positional asphyxiation. Sarah claimed that they had been playing a game of hide-and-seek. She zipped him into the suitcase as part of this game, believing he could unzip himself and escape. Later, her story evolved to some type of self-defense scenario, which is covered in her testimony. After zipping him in the suitcase, Sarah went to bed and found him dead the next morning. She was charged with second-degree murder. Leading up to her trial, she went through 8 attorneys after complaining about some of them. She turned down a plea deal for manslaughter with a 15-year prison sentence, which would have allowed her to be out in 8 years, counting time served and gain time. In Florida, gain time is the same thing as good time in other places. This was a surprising development because this seemed like a good plea deal. Sarah's trial started on October 14, 2024. Now moving to a summary of Sarah Boone's testimony. On October 22, 2024, Sarah testified in her own defense. Under direct examination, Sarah testified for hours. She talked about how she was born in Atlanta and moved to Orange County, Florida when she was 3 years old. Her father died when she was a senior in high school. Her mother died a few years later. Sarah married a man named Brian Boone on August 21, 2004. They had a child together, a son named Lucas. The couple divorced in 2017. At around this time, Sarah met George Torres at a bar. They had a lot of things in common, and he said nice things to her. Sarah moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Winter Park. George lived there as well and helped to pay the rent. They were on again, off again during the next 3 years. I found it curious how when Sarah was testifying, she didn't really acknowledge the on-again, off-again part until her attorney kind of pressed a bit. This takes us to February 23, 2020, the day before Sarah called 911 and reported George dead. She testified that she and George cleaned up the apartment that day. Their intent was to relax. They drove to a nearby Publix supermarket and purchased wine. They drank it on the back porch as they smoked cigarettes. So not just a relaxing day, a healthy day too. As they became intoxicated, they supported and encouraged each other. Later, without Sarah's knowledge or consent, George went back to Publix and bought another bottle of wine. Even though this was his idea, and again, Sarah had nothing to do with it, they both consumed this wine. They were very intoxicated. Apparently, this was not out of the ordinary for them. They put together a 1,000-piece puzzle, but one piece was missing. I have a feeling a lot of pieces were missing from their puzzle. After listening to music on the radio, George tapped Sarah and said, "You're it." To her, this expression initiated a game of hide-and-seek, even though it sounds more like a game of tag. Sarah ran upstairs and climbed in the shower. This was her hiding spot. George did not come upstairs and find her. When Sarah went downstairs, she saw George settling in to a suitcase. This suitcase was owned by him. He had recently brought it downstairs. As they were laughing and carrying on, Sarah zipped George in the suitcase. She joked about how he was small enough to fit inside. George only weighed 103 pounds. Sarah said that she weighed 98 pounds back then. Sarah moved the suitcase around and flipped it over as they continued to laugh. The couple was having a good old time. This is when Sarah recorded the first of 2 videos on her cell phone. In this video, which was recorded at 11:12 p.m., George pleaded with Sarah as she taunted him. When George indicated he could not breathe, Sarah replied, "That's on you." This video is strong evidence against Sarah, so addressing it was critical for her. Here's how Sarah explained her behavior. She recorded this video because she was in a position of feeling safe with George trapped in the suitcase. He was powerless to harm her. So this was an unusual experience for Sarah. She typically did not feel safe. She could now talk to George and give him a better understanding of her feelings. This was George's chance to become a better person. She wanted him to be uncomfortable during this process, but only to help him. As they continued to talk, George's demeanor changed. His tone became mean. Sarah recognized this tone as one that preceded violence on the part of George. Sarah became frightened as the discussion became heated. George was punching inside the suitcase in an effort to escape. When his hand came out, Sarah grabbed the suitcase and shook it in order to get his hand back in. Sarah believed that her life was at stake, so she retrieved a baseball bat and poked George's hand. His hand became bruised in this poking process. She also pushed on the suitcase with the baseball bat. George's hand retracted, and she flipped the suitcase back over. 11 minutes after the first video, Sarah recorded a second video, but this really wasn't talked about too much when she was on the stand. Sarah testified that she did not believe George would die, had no intent to kill him, and she just wanted him to stop being angry. He was going to blanking end her if he escaped. So Sarah was saying that he was homicidal. At this point, Sarah's attorney started asking questions about February 24, 2020. Sarah said on that day when she woke up, she thought George had left the apartment. She looked for him and then remembered what happened with the suitcase. When she unzipped it, she was aghast and in terror. She screamed his name and performed CPR. Sarah called her ex-husband Brian to prevent him from bringing her son over. It wasn't a good time with the dead body and all. Eventually, Sarah called 911. Sarah testified that she loved George. They were passionate, two bodies in one soul, and had a strong connection. At this point, the questions shifted to discuss how George was a bad guy. According to Sarah, if George could have had his way, he would have consumed alcohol from sun up to sundown. His drinking stopped Sarah from helping him. While intoxicated, George had attacked Sarah on multiple occasions throughout the relationship. Sarah's attorney led her through multiple incidents, some of which she described in great detail. For example, Sarah described attacks where George injured her finger, burned her arm, stabbed her in the leg, pulled her face across a carpet, slammed her head into a metal closet, stomped on her face, cut her leg, injured her arm as she was pulling away from him, punched her in the ear, hit her in the head with a metal curtain rod, and threatened to kill her dogs. Sarah had 2 dogs that lived in the apartment. Despite all these terrible behaviors, Sarah sacrificed herself by staying in the relationship so George could be better. This was really all about helping George. She loved him and once felt protected by him. He changed over time and left Sarah in a permanent state of being fearful. She could never relax. She was always trying to placate George as she searched for the original George, the one who was a good guy. Direct examination ended with Sarah talking about how George's level of intoxication around the time of his death was consistent with violence. Sarah had a 6th sense after having been trained by fear. She did not want to die that night. At this point, the prosecutor took over and started cross-examination. He had Sarah talk about a few things, including how she was really intoxicated, she failed to call 911, George only threatened her after saying he could not breathe, Sarah acted like George was a child, she overused the word notorious, she lied to the police about hurting George, and she did not seem to understand the rules of the game hide and seek. Going back to that notorious piece, during Sarah's testimony, she kept calling George notorious, like George was notorious for doing this and that. She did overuse the word notorious quite a bit. The prosecutor had Sarah demonstrate how she zipped George in the suitcase. He asked Sarah if she did anything to help George escape. She responded, no. Nothing meaningful happened on redirect examination, and this was the end of Sarah's testimony. Now moving to my analysis. Here are my thoughts on a few areas that stood out to me in this case. Item number 1. Overall, Sarah did a good job of not behaving in an overwhelmingly obnoxious manner. She overused the word notorious, as I mentioned, and there were a few moments where she failed to explain herself well. But overall, she avoided sound bites that could be used against her, like in closing arguments. There were no gotcha moments other than those inherent to her bizarre story. I guess what I'm saying is she didn't really make it worse. I think her biggest mistake was failing to describe her feelings when talking about George. For instance, she struggled to explain her reaction to seeing George's dead body. She used the words aghast and terror, but this is something she really could have drawn out a little more with additional adjectives. She needed to unzip this a little more, although historically, unzipping has been a challenge for her. Her general lack of emotions helped her not to make any dramatic or catastrophic mistakes, but that deficit also made her seem cold and callous. This was her chance to look like a human being, and she didn't really succeed. Limited emotional expressions can be thought of as a double-edged sword in this type of situation. She needed them to be limited at certain times, but she needed to be more expressive at other times. She didn't always deploy her emotions in a way that helped her case. Item number 2, Sarah scored points when she described George's many episodes of violence against her. Having photographic evidence to support her claims also helped a lot. Some of those images were really brutal. George's violent nature is the cornerstone of Sarah's defense. So this is an area where she needed to bring her A game, and she did. One area where Sarah struggled was connecting George's violent past with her reaction of leaving him in the suitcase. She talked about this a little, like the sixth sense and the constant fear, but she left a gaping hole in her story. If Sarah felt safe with George in the suitcase, and releasing him would have resulted in her death, why didn't she call 911? What was her long-term plan? George was going to get out of the suitcase at some point. He was going to be pretty mad then, at least that's a possibility. Sarah committed to the self-defense strategy, and now she's stuck not being able to explain how exactly she acted in self-defense. Why did she need to kill George in that moment? Item number 3, the way Sarah described George made him sound like he was an infant. She was in a position of superiority over him, like a mother or babysitter, always trying to keep him out of trouble and trying to raise him to be a responsible adult. Her job was to maintain and focus him, like she had to keep him busy so he wouldn't drink himself to death or otherwise get in trouble. She was there to entertain him. Sarah also pointed out that he very much enjoyed watching cartoons. Sarah would like people to believe that George was not only a violent man, he was childlike too. He was like an out-of-control, wannabe homicidal offender when he was intoxicated, but the rest of the time, he was just dependent and needy. Item number 4, many people are not happy with the state's cross-examination, suggesting the prosecutor missed a lot of opportunities to expose inconsistencies with Sarah's narrative. For instance, why didn't he have Sarah try to reconcile George saying he couldn't breathe with her belief that he wouldn't die? I don't know what the prosecutor was doing here. Maybe he was a bit overwhelmed by Sarah's testimony and didn't know how to exploit all the weaknesses. It's also possible that he deliberately kept things simple. In a way, Sarah's testimony can be thought of as just about a confession to at least manslaughter. Perhaps the prosecutor thought the only component necessary to convince the jury was seeing Sarah zip up that suitcase. There it is. That's the murder. All the rest is just smoke and mirrors. Previous violence, George being a bad guy, George drinking too much, none of that really mattered in that moment. If an argument becomes too complex, that's not always a good thing for getting a conviction. I didn't think the cross-examination was that bad, but the prosecutor should have hammered away at more of the inconsistencies. Moving to my final item, number 5. Did Sarah help herself through her testimony? Here's how I look at this. The evidence already established that Sarah killed George. So if she didn't explain it on the stand, everybody would think it was murder. She really had to testify. Or put another way, keeping her mouth zipped wasn't an option. I think she helped herself during her testimony. She established that George was violent, and she didn't get beat up too badly during the cross-examination. The problem is her case is weak overall. It has some major problems with it. It's like she scored a touchdown in a game where she was 28 points behind. Is a touchdown good? Of course it is. But considering the deficit, Sarah probably shouldn't dance in the end zone. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you soon.